and just get into it. So my first question is, what does the Xerces Society do?
Well, we are a conservation nonprofit. And so our main focus is the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We're international, but most of our work is focused on North America and in particular the US, which is where all of our staff are located.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to give people a general idea and, kind of have it come from you. So that's
Yeah,
great. And then how did you get involved with this work?
I I kind of started with plants. And then I was working for the Forest Service in the BLM, and we actually contracted with Xerces to do some surveys for beetles, and that's when I first learned about them. And I was like, oh my gosh, you can do this for a living, like work in insect conservation, which is so cool. And so I got kind of obsessed and started looking for jobs at Xerces, and yeah, now I've been here almost 10 years.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
amazing. And then it kind of goes into my follow-up question, which is what does it mean to be a firefly specialist? Because I saw that that was one of your titles in your like about me Xerces profile. And so, yeah, I was kind of wondering, are you like a coleopterist or how did you become a specialist?
Not a coleopterist. Yeah, at Xerces, so we have at least in the Endangered Species program, which is the program I'm in, we have kind of these sub-program leads, and so Fireflies is one of our bigger sub-programs, and so we launched that I think in 2018. So I've been working quite a bit on Fireflies in the last, what is it, 4 years now, and so yeah, I'm slowly building up my expertise in fireflies, but I'm not a coleopterist. I do a lot of work with many different species and groups. But the last few years has been heavily kind of focused on fireflies.
Oh, that's really cool. And then as a firefly specialist, what do you do?
So a lot of it the last few years has been focused on kind of building partnerships with the research community and really getting a handle on what we know about fireflies. So a lot of these sub-programs at Xerces start because we initially get a lot of reports of people saying like, hey, I'm seeing a lot fewer of this particular animal in the landscape. So we have a monarch program, we have a bumblebee program, we have a mussel program, and those all started because people expressed a lot of concern. And when you start getting all of these anecdotal reports, it's alarming. So we had that happen with fireflies, and we're like, well, let's look into this a little bit further and see what the status is. And so that's really the last like, I don't know, 3 or 4 years has been just focused on like, what is the status of fireflies in the US and Canada in particular. And so we have worked with the Firefly Research community and with land managers and some folks in the public just to kind of understand where we are and get kind of the state of the knowledge of fireflies. And now that we've done that, we've assessed the majority of species that occur here. And so we're kind of taking that information now. We've identified priority species, and we're launching a big new project this year called the Firefly Atlas. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and trying to get people to look for threatened and data deficient species. And so we're kind of moving into the next phase of now that we kind of have our baseline, like where do we go from here?
Yes, I actually read your paper where you evaluated the firefly extinction risk. It was super
Yeah.
interesting. And
Oh,
it-
awesome.
yeah, it really shocked me that like, little old Delaware, like we're home to some of the most endangered species. So kind of keeping that in
Yeah.
mind, what are some things that people here in Delaware can do so that we're not endangering our firefly species?
Yeah. So a lot of it is very like habitat based, right? So if you do have a yard or some other outdoor space, making sure that you're not like cutting everything down if you have a lawn, like kind of letting things get a little wild and weedy, so that fireflies have a place to shelter. I think a lot of people forget about the other life stages of fireflies. So, we have these amazing adults that flash at night and are very, very exciting, but fireflies spend most of their lives as larvae, and they usually live underground or at the ground surface, and they're larvae for up to 2 years. So anything you do that impacts the ground can impact those fireflies. Like you can trample them, you can accidentally poison them. So there are all these different things that you can do just by not trampling, by providing habitat, by not using pesticides. A big thing too is light pollution really affects fireflies. And so doing things like turning off your lights at night, or outside lights, and not letting light, shine outside of windows, using curtains, putting things on timers, things like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. And then another thing kind of relating to firefly conservation and less specific to Delaware is, do you see firefly conservation as kind of a stepping stone for more beetle conservation? Because they are some of the more charismatic beetles. Is that like
Yeah,
one of the goals of the firefly program that you're working on?
it's definitely something that we have in mind, and beyond beetles too, because as you can imagine, getting people excited about saving insects can be really hard, especially when it's ones that people think are like ugly or gross or scary.
Yeah,
And
butterflies get
so
all the hype.
butterflies get all the hype, and butterflies are great. I work with butterflies a lot too, but I think fireflies have this special opportunity to bring a lot of people in to the conversation who may not be like your typical conservation audience, right? Like I think a lot of people come into conservation through butterflies because they're already interested in pollinators and pollinator conservation. And I think with fireflies, we can really speak to a whole different group of people. Like they're just so universally loved, and they just occur. I mean, butterflies occur in a lot of places too, but yes, I think for sure we are keeping that in mind.
Yeah, that's really cool. So then, my next few questions are kind of more specific to the Bethany Beach firefly. So first, can you give us a general definition of the Bethany Beach firefly, and then what makes this species unique?
Yeah, so this species, well, up until 2 years ago, it was thought to only occur in Delaware, and we actually know that it now occurs in Maryland.
Oh my gosh, my mind's blown.
So I know for a while we were like, this might be Delaware's only endemic firefly. It's not true anymore, but it is a really interesting species in that it has a really specific habitat that it's associated with. And so it's only been found in these interdunal swales. So these like wetland complexes that occur between dune systems right along the coast. And so they're just like in this narrow strip of land. And we don't know of any other, well, that's not true. But yeah, they're part of the Photurus genus. So there's a lot of species. There's 172 described firefly species in the US and Canada. And I think like 65 to 70 of those are Photurus fireflies.
Wow.
And Photurus are the hardest genus to identify because a lot of the species look almost identical, if not identical. And so you have to really use this combination of, having the firefly in hand and looking at it, plus saying like, okay, well, I found it in this particular habitat, and then looking at the timing of when it's active during the year, and then also looking at its flash patterns and behaviors. So there's a lot of like different clues and pieces that you need to ID it. But this firefly is kind of nice in the Photurus realm because it has this quick, bright double green flash. and it's only found in these really specific habitats. And so if you're in an interdunal swale along the coast of Maryland or Delaware at this time of year and see a bright double green flash, you're probably seeing Bethany beach firefly.
Oh, that's great to know that they're easy to identify because, yeah, I've actually taken a taxonomy course and like at one point we talked about how like most fireflies, like most species from that family, like you can't even identify them when they're dead to the species level. So
Yeah.
that's really great to know that, yeah, they're very distinct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then what ecosystem services within the interdunal swales does the Bethany Beach firefly provide?
We don't actually know, and that's true for a lot of the different firefly species.
Oh,
I mean, we know that they are a food source to like spiders and frogs in particular, just fireflies generally. A lot of things won't eat them because they're toxic, or they at least display toxic warning, signals. So things will tend to avoid them, but there are some animals that have kind of figured out workarounds or just don't seem to mind their bad taste. Um, and then so yeah, they're a food source. Their larvae are also really predatory. And so they can provide kind of this checks and balances for things like slugs and snails and worms and other soft-bodied organisms that live in the ground. As far as we know, most species eat those kinds of soft-bodied animals. Yeah, I'd say those are the two biggest ones.
that's really interesting. So it mostly serves like, within the ecosystem, its biggest purpose is with other organisms as opposed to the more abiotic factors.
Yeah, and I mean, this there's been so little research into this. The more I learn about fireflies, the more shocked I am that there's so much we don't know. Because when I came into fireflies, I just thought like, oh, everyone loves these. They're going to be so like overly studied, and they're just not.
Huh.
There are definitely a few species that have been studied in depth, and definitely like their bioluminescence and their courtship and all of that has been extensively studied. But a lot of other really basic, like natural history, life history topics haven't been looked into. We don't even know if most species like prefer certain types of invertebrate prey over others, or if they're linked to like a very specific species of snail, or what other roles they might be playing in their environment. But I think it's like any other species, right? Like you start losing something and you don't know what role it's playing, and it just kind of leads to this like slow crumbling and collapse of this fabric of the ecosystem.
Yeah. So, kind of another question that kind of has to do with the Bethany Beach firefly. What does it eat as an adult?
So a lot of fireflies don't eat as adults that we know
Oh,
of. But this one, you probably read about this if you were studying Photurus, but a lot of the Photurus females are predatory and they eat other fireflies. Um,
I
so
didn't know that. That's blowing my mind.
yeah, so they eat their own kind. um, and that they do that because a lot of fireflies have this toxin in them that makes them distasteful and provides protection, but for tourist fireflies, they don't produce that toxin, and so the females will basically go out at night and they will mimic the flash patterns of other species and basically attract a male into them because he thinks she's his species and is talking to him, and then she'll eat him because he has these protective toxins. And so by eating him, she basically is able to pass them on to her offspring so that they then have the protective
Oh,
toxins.
wow. So it's
Yeah.
kind of similar to frogs, like how frogs, they aren't born with toxins, but they get the toxins through eating other toxic things.
Yeah. Or like monarchs too, where they eat like milkweed and bring in
Yeah.
those toxins. Yeah. Yeah. It's a little
Oh,
different that they're basically eating their own
Yeah, femme fatales.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and other than that, I mean, there have been some observations of adults like nectaring on some flowers or like eating sap or things like that, but there aren't a lot of observations of that, and it doesn't seem like most adults need to eat, mostly in the larval stage.
Wow, well, that's really interesting. So
Yeah.
then my next question is, what has the Xerces Society done for the Bethany Beach firefly?
So for this species, this is actually one of the first projects we worked on, but we worked with the Center for Biological Diversity to compile and submit a petition for listing. Um, and so we were really concerned about the firefly because even before we did this big assessment across the US and Canada to see where kind of fireflies fell in that extinction risk category, we were really concerned about this species because at the time it was only known from 7 sites. And the stronghold of its population was this one site that was on private land that was being developed. And so the whole habitat got wiped out. And that kind of, sounded the alarm to us and CB. We were like, we need to quickly submit this petition, otherwise this firefly might be wiped out. So that was the first thing we did. And then when we did do these IUCN Red List assessments, which fed into that paper you mentioned, this came out as the most at-risk firefly. It was the only one that we assessed as critically endangered with the IUCN categories. So in some ways it was kind of nice to have that like bolstered, like, yes, we're very, very concerned about this species. So after the petition, we got a positive 90-day finding. So the service is going to start a species status assessment in the next few years, and their decision is due in 2024. So it's a slow process.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we've been working with researchers in Delaware who are focused on this species, and then also working with folks from Delaware state parks, because all of the other known occurrences are on state park lands. So we've just been working with them to kind of like provide support and technical advice for like mitigating light pollution at known sites and providing conservation guidance. I was actually just out there 2 weeks ago doing surveys with one of the Delaware biologists. We went down to Maryland, but we did a workshop in Delaware to train folks on how to look for this species at other sites in Delaware. And so we're hoping that there are more occurrences of it, which would it would just be nice to know that they're not just like these few little scattered locations.
Yeah.
They're really fragmented and kind of degraded. So
So,
yeah.
like right now, a lot of efforts are kind of on the hunt for more habitats and more places we could potentially find them.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. So yeah, trying to find additional populations, but then also working with land managers of existing known populations to make sure that those sites are protected and kind of offering, yeah, technical advice and expertise to and suggestions for like how they could protect the habitat and the fireflies of those sites. The species is really hard because other than direct degradation of the habitat, like with a developer coming in and leveling everything, the other really big threats to it are like climate change, which is really hard for a land manager to grapple with that, right? So like sea
Yeah.
level rise is a really big one for Bethany Beach firefly, and so yeah, there are some things within our grasp and others that aren't, and so kind of trying to figure out a way to make sure that um, the sites are resilient against climate change, and that we're protecting all the sites that we can find. So.
Oh, that's really interesting because I was actually going to ask what are the biggest threats to Bethany Beach fireflies, but you've already answered that question. So, kind of like going into what you're saying, how do we make the sites that they are found at more resilient to climate change?
Yeah, that's a really tough question and one that we're trying to figure out. And it's always hard to like yeah, to know like how to kind of usher in this new habitat type that will be resilient in whatever future climate that we have. But I think a lot of it goes back to just making sure that these sites where they occur or are suspected to occur are in the best shape that they can be. So like invasive species is another big issue, like Phragmites. So just making sure that sites aren't taken over by invasives, which is definitely something that land managers can work on. And then even like natural processes like a succession of plant communities. Some of these interdunal swales will eventually move back into like forested areas. So trying to adopt strategies that keep some of these in kind of an early stage where they're still just grasses and reeds and some small shrubs and areas where fireflies can still thrive. It's really important.
Wow, that's great. And then, so kind of going back to like your petition for the Bethany Beach firefly to be protected by the Endangered Species Act, um, what would that, like, what would being a federally protected endangered species, how could that help the Bethany Beach firefly?
Well, it would help, ideally, it would help protect against those threats that I just mentioned, right? Especially
Yeah.
something like habitat loss or fragmentation. So if it's like we know it occurs here, we can protect it. We have kind of this federal regulation and law to support it.
Mm.
Um, and then hopefully it would lead to restoration of other sites as well. Yeah, this species, like I said, is just it's dependent on a really rare ecosystem type that's already kind of in trouble. And I feel like that's true of wetland ecosystems like across the board.
Yeah.
And so I think having this species protected could in turn protect that habitat and then other species that occur there. It's just such a unique ecosystem. We've also found too that petitioning and listing species like ends up leading to this huge concerted effort to then make sure that the species doesn't go extinct. And so even just kind of raising the profile of the species and having the ability to direct like federal and state dollars to more of these restoration and survey efforts is really important. Yeah, I think those are some of the big ones.
Yeah, so kind
And
of like providing more resources and enforcement so that we can implement these ideas we have already.
yeah, and I think
Okay.
this too, like this would be the first firefly if it is listed to be listed. And I think it would really help raise the profile of fireflies generally too. And I think a lot of people don't realize that there are quite a few species of fireflies that are really at risk right now. And so I think it could help open up a national conversation about that too.
That's great. Kind of going into like the precedent it would set in terms
Yeah,
of firefly protection.
yeah.
Yeah, so then um, taking another look at protecting the Bethany Beach firefly, what are some things that locals can do right now to protect the Bethany Beach firefly? Like locals living in that strip of land in southern Delaware and Maryland.
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think a big thing because the fireflies, especially the larvae, are so sensitive to things like trampling or degradation of the habitat. Like some really simple things are just like if you're going out to the beach or through the dune systems, like use established trails. Don't just kind of go marching off into wherever where you might be trampling through some of this really important habitat for them. There's not driving cars through these dune systems because that will definitely trample fireflies. And then especially in somewhere like Bethany Beach and some of those other beach communities where there's development like right up to the beachfront itself. I think really trying to mitigate light pollution is a big one for fireflies there. Not just the Bethany Beach firefly. There's just there's so many buildings and so many lights. And I think if folks could, yeah, turn off their outdoor lights at night or put them on some sort of timer or motion sensor schedule, it would help kind of, I don't know, mitigate that a little bit. It's such a populated area of the US and there's so much light pollution generally that it's
Yeah.
but those like very localized point sources of light really do impact fireflies. And the brighter it gets, the less easy it is for fireflies to see each other's flash patterns. And so if the females and males can't see each other flashing, they're not going to be able to mate, they're not going to reproduce. And so that just leads to another kind of cascading issue with the populations.
Okay. Those are really good suggestions. And yeah, the kind of things that I can really see people implementing. So then now that we've gone over what, the government can do, what people can do, what our research is showing, do you think that even with all this stuff and, considering the climate conditions of the Delaware area and light pollution, do you think that there's a lot of hope for protecting the Bethany Beach firefly?
I do. And after being in Maryland and Delaware a couple weeks ago, like we found some really amazing sites in Maryland, and it gives me hope that there are populations that we just aren't aware of. And I was also just kind of amazed at like the group I was with that came together, and it was all of these different federal and state agencies working together to do surveys and just to find out more about this species and what it needs. And I was just really like, I felt very positive leaving that trip because there was a lot of great collaboration and interest in the species. And I think having relationships like that goes a long way to protecting species. And it's fireflies. People love fireflies.
Yeah, especially special green beach fireflies.
Yeah. And I think too, I mean, even though now it's not, Delaware's only endemic firefly, like it's still such a special animal that's found in a very small area of the country. And I think it really can be kind of this, symbol of insect conservation and these like very cool dune ecosystems.
Yeah, and wetlands preservation too.
Yeah, exactly. Like some kind of flagship for conservation. So yeah, I do have hope. I feel like it's easy in invertebrate conservation to get really like doom and gloom because things aren't great.
Yeah.
But I think having a lot of really like passionate and caring people who are working on species conservation, and I think so much of it is just about like communicating and engaging people. And I think at their core, a lot of people want to help. And so I think it's just providing the information and resources for that is, I think, really important.